Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Muscle Matter session on limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. We'll just let people come through from the waiting room and then we'll begin. So thank you for joining us and we'll start formally shortly. Good afternoon, everybody. I can still see people coming through from the waiting room. So welcome to this limb-girdle muscular dystrophy Muscle Matters session from MDUK. We will start formally in a few moments' time. Okay, I think I can see the numbers are stabilizing, so I'll kick us off. So yeah, thank you very much, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's Muscles Matter online seminar on limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, which follows last Friday's Limb-Girdle Muscular Dystrophy Awareness Day. I'm Rob Burley. I'm MDUK's Director of Care, Communications and Support, and it's a great pleasure to be chairing this session in what is now our third run of these seminar sessions. We've got a very packed agenda this afternoon with a fantastic array of speakers, and we're going to split the session into two parts. So we'll start by looking at the latest developments around research into limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, and there'll be a chance for any questions specific to that area. And we'll then move on to discussing living with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, where we'll focus on questions as well at that point. As well as covering questions that we've had submitted in advance. So thank you to those who've done that. We'll also be using the Q&A function, which you should be able to see at the bottom of the screen. Please type your question or comment and we'll feed them into the discussion. To help us manage the technical side of the event, we won't be calling on questioners to ask their questions directly. Any questions we don't manage to cover or that we don't know the answers to, we'll seek to answer either directly to the questioner after the session or via our website. A quick note before we begin that our helpline is available to anyone affected by muscle wasting conditions. So do please contact us if you have any need of support or any questions, either separate to this session or that are sparked by this session. We can help you with information and we can either support you directly or signpost you to the right place where you can get the support you need. The number is 0800 652 6352. Or you can email info@musculardystrophyuk.org. We'd like to thank our sponsors today, as well as our panel. So our sponsors are PTC, Therapeutics and Sarepta. And finally, a reminder that we're recording this session and it will be made available over the next few days on our website. And you can also see all previous recordings of Muscle Matter sessions through our website onto our YouTube channel as well. So to start us off this afternoon, I'm delighted to hand over to my colleague, MDUK's Director of Research and Innovation, Dr. Kate Adcock, who will introduce our research speakers and then chair the first part of the discussion. Kate, over to you.
Thank you, Rob, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm delighted that we've got hopefully two speakers with us this afternoon who will be a delight to hear, I know. First of all, I'd like to introduce you to Meredith James, who's a clinical specialist neuromuscular physiotherapist at the John Walton Muscular Dystrophy Research Centre at Newcastle University. In her clinical work, Meredith is an expert in functional assessments of patients with neuromuscular conditions, and her research has focused on clinical evaluation of children and adults involved in natural history studies and in clinical trials, as well as developing clinically meaningful and reliable and sensitive outcome measures. Her work focuses mainly on Duchenne muscular dystrophy and of course on limb-girdle muscular dystrophies. Meredith is in the final stages of writing up her PhD, and from experience, I know how awful that can be. So we are so very grateful for you to take time out today, Meredith, to be with us. And we're going to be really excited to hear what you have to tell us. Joining Meredith in a few moments will be Professor Jordi Diaz-Manera. Professor Manera is the Professor of Neuromuscular Disorders at Newcastle University. He's also a consultant clinical geneticist at the Newcastle Hospital's NHS Foundation Trust. Originally, he trained as a neurologist in Barcelona, and in 2013, he obtained his PhD from the University of Barcelona, where he studied new diagnostic and therapeutic aspects of dysperlinopathies. Professor Diaz-Manera has interest in a range of neuromuscular conditions, including Duchenne muscular dystrophy, Pompe disease, and of course, various different types of limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. His research encompasses both basic research on muscle fibrosis, that's kind of scarring of muscle, and the fat replacement that happens in muscular dystrophies, but is also interested in the clinical research on the aspects and use of magnetic resonance imaging for diagnosis and the follow-up of patients. And I'm sure he'll be also fascinating to hear from. So without further ado, Meredith, can I hand over to you? I believe you're going to share your screen and we'll hear your talk. So thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Hopefully now my slides have appeared on the screen and we're good to go. Okay, so I'm going to take us on a whistle-stop tour around what outcome measures are and what natural history studies are and why we need both of those, and let you know about some of the work that's been going on the last few years within Limb-Girdle on both of those things. And thankfully, that has led us towards some standards of care, which is, you know, a real impact for patients in the UK and internationally as well. So just a rapid review of an audience that are very well familiar with what limb-girdle muscular dystrophy is. So it's a disease that primarily affects the muscles around the shoulder girdle and the pelvic girdle, but we know it affects down lower in the legs as well, and it can affect in the forearms too. There's been a name change. So when you're reading about limb-girdle now, you might have had a disease when you got a diagnosis that was called 2B or 2I, and now that's switched because we ran out of letters of the alphabet, essentially. And so now when we talk about the recessive limb-girdle muscular dystrophies, those have got an R in front of them with a number, and the dominant forms, which are far rarer, have now got a D. And we know in terms of progression of these diseases, it is usually slow, but everybody's individual trajectories are different. And there are periods where you have rapid decline, and then there's periods where you're more stable. And one of the issues for us as clinicians working with people with limb-girdle was that we didn't have appropriate and validated outcome measures. So we didn't have the right tests to talk the same language internationally about how the disease was affecting people. So I'm going to talk about outcome measures a little bit more. So what are they? Well, they're the tests, the questionnaires, the surveys, the blood tests, the plasma tests that we use to try and understand how the disease impacts on people. And so as a physiotherapist, I'm really interested in looking at how people are moving and how they manage to get up out of bed or stand up off the chair or walking or wheelchair use, upper limb function. So my primary interest is in about motor function. And I can use strength tests and timed tests. I measure lung function as part of my physiotherapy role. And then my colleagues would look at things like biomarkers, so using the blood to look at the DNA or protein levels or other molecules such as enzymes to try and understand how the disease is affecting those. We also use MRI scans to look at the muscles and how the disease is impacting the muscles. And we do use a lot of questionnaires as well. And why do we need them? Well, they outcome measures, when we pick the right ones, they assist us in making the right diagnosis for people. They allow us to see how the disease is impacting daily life, and then they allow us to then monitor change between clinic visits about how that disease is going on. Potentially in the future, and particularly important at the moment, is if we use the same outcome measures between centres and between clinicians, that can build us a big database of how the disease progresses and changes, which may allow us to have a control group for any clinical trials of new medications in the future. And what's important about outcome measures is that we don't use the same things year in, year out. We have to be critical of them and make sure that actually are relevant to our patients and the lived experience of their disease. So they need to be patient-centered. And so whilst we would like to think, and statistically would be much easier if the disease progressed in a very linear pattern, that we know the reality is very much different to that. It is a bit of a piece of spaghetti. And unfortunately, we're not always sure what you're going to wake up with that day. And our job as clinicians is to make sure that we're using the right tests to measure the impact of the disease, but also putting the information from all of those tests together to then try and understand how to predict what's going to happen next and allow people to have more control over their lives by being able to predict what could be coming and proactively plan for future needs. So clinically, having patient-centered outcome measures is really, really important. But it's also important for our research for future drug trials. Whilst we'd love to launch straight into a clinical trial of a new medication, we have to be able to measure the impact of that medication and ensure that it's clinically meaningful to patients and it's causing enough of an improvement to make it tolerable. And so the outcome measures are really important there because we use them in drug trials as well to measure the impact of an intervention. The best way to gather the data around our rare limb-girdle muscular dystrophies is to run natural history studies. And that's allowing us to speak the same language around the globe, all the clinicians around the globe, measuring the patients with the same tests done in the same way every time so that we can accurately capture what the disease causes and how it changes over time. And so it's using all those different outcome measures again. And I'm just going to give the example of our clinical outcome study for dysferlinopathy, which has been run out of Newcastle just for 10 years now and made some real inroads in the limb-girdle community internationally. It is very encouragingly, we've had a lot of limb-girdle natural history studies and we're getting much better at doing them. And the language that we all speak as clinicians internationally has become much more the same. We're not comparing apples and oranges by doing different things. We're becoming much more cohesive and standardizing what we do to try and use the right tests and not put people through hours and hours of assessments that aren't appropriate. So you can see here, there's lots of different limb-girdle muscular dystrophies that have got natural history studies ongoing at the moment. And encouragingly, you can see that there's more and more going on at the moment. So we've got various studies. Some are academic, some are run by drug companies that are covering a large range of limb-girdle subtypes. So the clinical outcome study for dysferlinopathy is led by Newcastle over the last 10 years, and we had 15 sites. Our patients were originally in for 3 years, but have stayed with us for the journey, and that allowed us to capture 200 patients around the globe. At that time, 10 years ago, we didn't have any limb-girdle muscular dystrophy specific scales, and we knew that not one scale fits all. If you are using a mobility aid, then using a walking test is going to be entirely inappropriate for you. So we needed to make sure we had the right scales for the right people. And so what we did, and if any of our COS patients are on the webinar today, they will know that they spent many hours with the physiotherapists undergoing many assessments. So we did. We threw the kitchen sink of assessments in COS originally for the first year. And then after a year, we saw how those assessments behaved, got rid of the ones that were inappropriate, that the patients didn't feel was useful, and then refined things to actually come up with the first limb-girdle specific scale. So like we have the North Star in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, we now have a North Star scale for limb-girdle type muscular dystrophies for limb-girdle, which is great. And so what it's allowed us to do by doing a natural history study and seeing people regularly over a long period of time is to refine the toolbox of assessments and to be able to inform the regulators like the FDA or EMA about which assessments are actually appropriate for our patients and which ones could be used in future clinical trials. And so here, these graphs, the horizontal axis is our North Star score, and the higher the score, the less the disease impacts your ability to walk or run or jump. And then in the graph on the left, we can see the time taken to get to walk or run 100 meters. And so by doing both of those tests, we can see that we actually have a nice relationship. So the higher your North Star score, the faster you can get around 100 meters, and some of those patients can run. And then in the second scale, the second graph on the right, the y-axis, the vertical axis, this time is the performance of upper limb, which is a scale that measures the ability to use your arms, whether you can get your arms overhead, whether you can get your hands to mouth. And clinically, why this is really important that we've done this is that we can see that there are patients who score very highly on the North Star and score very highly on the pool, but equally, there are patients who are maybe great at walking, but also have really significant upper limb function. And why that's important is it means that we can tell clinicians around the globe that are seeing patients with limb-girdle that they need to check upper limb function when patients come to clinic as well, because it could be really significantly involved. And this work has only happened because COS has led us to make the first assessment, and our colleagues at Nationwide Children's Hospital in the States that we work very closely with have also used these scales in their clinic, and we've been able to combine data sets because now we all speak the same language of assessments, and that's the power of natural history. So COS2 is underway, and again, we're going around the world so that we can have enough patients with Limb-Girdle 2B to complete the study. And this will allow us to check that the assessments that we developed in COS1 are the right assessments, and to continue our work on standard of care as well. So natural history studies, they've allowed us to now speak the same language globally. They've allowed us to refine the assessments we use, so we're not putting people through hours and hours of testing. And so we have the right assessments so that we are measuring for management and perform and give essential information for drug trials. We've got our first limb-girdle specific scale of motor performance, and we'd like to see that rolled out clinically within the UK, but also internationally. And what COS has allowed us to do, because of our incredible patients, is to now start working on standards of care for limb-girdle, specifically starting with dysferlinopathy. And that's only been possible because of the commitment of our patients, not only in the UK, but around the globe, who upend their lives to come and see us, spend hours of having physiotherapy testing, as well as going in scanners and blood tests, to have brought us this far forward over the last 10 years. And that was only possible because the Jane Foundation, who are based in the States, funded the clinical outcome study for dysferlinopathy, and all these clinicians participated. There's also currently some work in 2I, so not just dysferlin, but we've also currently got a Limb-Girdle 2I natural history study run by Genathon. And what Genathon have been able to do is take the learnings from COS. So we're not reinventing the wheel anymore in natural history studies. We know which are the likely most useful assessments, and now they're applying that within a 2-year natural history study. And the first little bit of data that's just been released from that is showing us that in the 2I population, lung function and motor function, so ability to walk or stand up or move around in bed, are very closely related in the 2I population. And so that's allowing us to understand, again, what might be able to be useful to predict change to help patients manage their conditions. And so the natural history study, it all brings us back to our clinical management and trying to help our patients by providing the most efficient and informed knowledge to their care. So diagnosis, monitoring, more information about being able to predict what changes might be happening, advice for about exercise or lung function or cardiac care, and then taking that into a more global care by developing a standard of care. So in other muscle diseases, we have got standards of care, which are an agreement of clinicians and patients around the globe about how to best diagnose and manage a muscle condition. Because our diseases that we work with are very rare, they are international efforts. And so now, because of COS, we've got the first limb-girdle ones in development for dysferlinopathy. And we're working on those at the moment. And it's a real mix of looking at what professions need to be involved in the care of somebody with limb-girdle, looking at what the experts in the field, what their experience has been, the patient expert voice, because of course our patients with limb-girdle are the experts in their condition, and then bringing those together to create a template for what should happen within the clinic. And that's across a number of areas, so diagnosis, physiotherapy, pregnancy considerations, respiratory and cardiac care. Alongside COS, Dr. Anna Mayhew, and with the support of MDUK, has developed a comprehensive and dynamic education website for physiotherapists and other healthcare professions who can learn about muscular dystrophies, can learn about the assessments we've developed, and can actually go into a virtual clinic and practice doing the assessments. So whilst the new assessment for limb-girdle we developed in Newcastle, we're now taking that around to the world so that other clinicians can use that, and patients with limb-girdle have got access to the most appropriate assessment tools. There's also a lot of work around podcasts. So Louise Hallen in Scotland has got her podcast, Walks Like a Duck, which is on the BBC. And Anna Mayhew's also been chatting with one of our patients with dysvelinopathy about her experience living. And this is a great way to share knowledge about limb-girdle with the community. In terms of current studies in the UK, particularly in Newcastle, we're enrolling for 2 natural history studies at the moment, and those are for patients with genetically confirmed sarcoglycanopathies. So in the old terms, that's the 2C, 2D, 2E, 2F, or in the new terms, it's 3, 4, 5, or 6. If you are potentially interested, if you have a genetically confirmed sarcoglycanopathy and you might want to participate, the email address is up there, and we'd need to know who you are and who your local provider is and have your consent that we would be able to contact them regarding a trial. And in terms of why participate, why give up this time and inconvenience yourself to come and see us and spend hours with us every 6 months for a number of years? I felt it was important that I put some of our patients' comments about why they felt that participating in a natural history study where there's no treatment was useful and beneficial to them, and something that they've kept coming back year in, year out to come and see us. And so as a clinician, I think it gives me time. I'm not rushed necessarily. When it's a natural history visit, I have plenty of time to talk to people. And I think that that's reflected in the comments from our participants who have seen that they are an active part of research. They come and see people who understand the condition, and they know that they are changing the landscape for limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. So I think that should be my very brief overview before I tip over to Geordie. And thank you very much to our team at the John Walton and our patients from around the globe that are contributing to natural history studies and our knowledge of how to progress our management of limb-girdle. Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith. That was fantastic. Really interesting talk, and I've learned a lot. And it always amazes me how quickly I forget the different names and the renaming of them, of the different kinds of limb girdles. So thank you for those reminders, and please don't give me a test later on because I've forgotten again. It gives me great joy to hand the screen over now to Professor Diaz-Monera. Geordie, thank you for joining us. I think you've got the co-hosting rights, so over to you. Thank you.
That's fine. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, that's fantastic. So thank you very much, Kate. Thank you very much to Muscular Dystrophy UK for inviting me today. I'm very happy. It's the first time that I'm presenting something for you since I arrived to UK. I'm very grateful that you invited me. I hope it's just the first of many, as we commonly say. So I'm going to talk about new therapies for Limb-Girdle Muscular Dystrophy. So I decided to focus this talk in Limb-Girdle Muscular Dystrophies because sometimes we talk about Duchenne, of course. There are many new treatments arriving to the field of Duchenne, and about other diseases that have treatments in development, like Pompe disease sometimes, SMA. And when I talk to patients, I have the impression that they feel that there is nothing for limb-girdle, there is nothing for FSHD, there is nothing for myotonic dystrophy, and this is completely wrong. The research is really englobing all these diseases. There are new emerging therapies in the pipeline that, of course, are under development. Some of them are still in preclinical animal models. Some of them are already being tested in trials. So today I decided to talk about limb-girdle. It's one of my specialties, and I think that after Meredith's talk, it's pretty convenient to also give you an idea of what is going on in this field. So, as you may know, Limb-Girdle Muscular Dystrophies are a group of rare genetic disorders that are produced by mutations in genes that encode proteins that are expressed in the skeletal muscles. As Kate said, there are many different Limb-Girdle Muscular Dystrophies, more than 30. It's sometimes difficult to remember all these names, what are the genes, what are the proteins, etc. But I think it's important to understand that these are very similar from a genetic point of view because are produced by mutations in one single gene. Of course, a deficiency in these proteins induce muscle damage, and I think I can go to the next slide to explain this, because when we talk about the muscle damage and how this muscle progress in a patient, we will understand that we can act with therapies at many different levels. So in muscle disease like Limb-Girdle Muscular Dystrophy, we start with a healthy muscle here that lacks one of these proteins. So this is just an staining for dysferlin, which is a protein of the muscle membrane. We can see here a control where we can see the staining in green, but a patient will lack this protein. And this will induce damage to the muscle fibers with inflammation of the muscle, with necrosis of these muscle fibers, and a progressive loss of muscle fibers that are replaced by fat and fibrotic tissue. The bad thing about fat and fibrotic tissue is that it doesn't have any contractile property, and therefore it leads to permanent weakness, to contractures, sometimes to muscle stiffness, and of course, all this is irreversible. And in the end stage, we can have a muscle that is completely lost, and it's replaced by this fibrotic and fat tissue. So if we talk about strategies for these diseases, we can design strategies that try to restore the protein expression or restore the function of this protein, that can try to tackle the inflammation, that can try to reduce the fibrosis and fat expansion. And I will talk at the end about new strategies, so all the strategies, better say, that try to increase muscle tissue. So probably all of you know or heard about gene therapy. Gene therapy is something very trendy at this moment because some of the existing therapies already commercialized are based in this strategy. What is gene therapy? Gene therapy is a therapy that aims to restore the protein expression in cells of our body, in the tissues of our body, by many different ways. One can be providing a new and healthy copy of the gene that is mutated. Another strategy can be trying to fix the mutation. And sometimes we can also try to skip that mutation. So as you see, there are different ways of trying to solve the genetic problem. But today we are going to talk just about gene delivery, because it's probably the most relevant for the Limb-Girdle field. What is gene delivery? So in gene delivery, what we try to do is to bring a healthy copy of the gene that is mutated to the muscle fibers. For that, we need some components. The first component, and probably the most important one, is to have a transgene. So a transgene is an artificial gene that we have created in our lab that is similar or identical to the human gene that is missing. In the case of dysferlin, and Meredith has been talking about this disease, we can have a gene that is identical to the dysferlin gene. In the case of sarcoglycan, the same. So these are genes that are built in a lab. This gene will contain something called a promoter, and this promoter will ensure that the gene is only expressed in the muscle fibers. Because when we inject the gene will arrive to all our tissues, but we just want the muscle to express the gene. Then we need a carrier that will deliver this gene to as many cells as possible. And what we know are very good carriers are the viral vectors, virus. It's incredible that we are talking about virus use for therapy after COVID, but I think that COVID is also good to guess that a virus is the perfect carrier, because viruses are able to arrive almost everywhere. And we have learned during the last 30 years that there are many different types of virus, but there are some called adeno-associated virus that arrive very well to the muscle fibers, and they do not produce an inflammatory reaction that is too extreme. And of course, then we need our tissue cells. So what is the target? And the target in this case is a skeletal muscle. I would like to pay attention to this fact. So skeletal muscle is the most abundant tissue in the body. If we weigh 70 kilos, probably 35 kilos are muscle. So this means that we have millions of cells there, and we need a treatment that can arrive to all these cells. And this, of course, is much more complex than treating a kidney, than treating a liver, or even treating the heart, because they are smaller tissue, right? So we need very high doses of whatever treatment we want to develop. So in gene therapy, we have our virus that contain the gene. We are going to inject this to the bloodstream. The gene will arrive to the muscle. It recognizes some protein in the surface of the muscle fibers. It goes into the fibers and then release a copy of the gene that goes into the nuclei of the cell. And it's there where this gene will start being used to produce this protein that is lacking. And we will have the protein restored and hopefully fully functional. So that's one of the important things. We need to demonstrate all these in preclinical animal models, so in mice, for example, or in rats, depending on the disease, before moving this into patients. So gene therapy is nothing new. It has been studied for more than 30 years. So the first studies were in the 90s. The main idea was trying to demonstrate that after the injection, the protein was expressed again. And I think that you can clearly see here a muscle from a mice that was before the treatment. You can see that there was almost nothing there. And after the treatment, you can see that there is again expression of this protein. This is what we call a staining of the muscle. So AAV, so gene therapy, the gene therapy that we have today, has demonstrated to be able to restore the expression of the protein in the muscles. And we can demonstrate that by staining these muscles, but also doing a Western blot, that is this that you can see here, where we can identify these bands, and these bands are the protein, non-treated and the treated animals. You can see how we restore the expression of the protein. But it's not only about restoring the expression, it's being sure that this protein is fully functional. So it's able to have the same function that the wild type, the natural protein in our muscles. And this has been demonstrated for sarcoglycans, have been demonstrated in preclinical animal models of dysferlin, in NANO5, in FKRP. So in many diseases, we have this demonstration. And of course, having a protein that is able to function again can lead to a tissue that is improved, that is less dystrophic, and a muscle function that improves. And this is what we try to analyze and investigate when we treat animal models of the different limb-girdles with gene therapy, because we need to be sure that the treatment is safe, of course, but also we need to be sure that the treatment works in these models before moving this into humans. So you can ask now, is there any gene therapy for limb-girdle that is already tested or that is already being tested in humans? And the answer is yes. So the first studies in humans with gene therapy were done more than 10 years ago and was a kind of proof of principle. We need to start with this kind of experiments to demonstrate that this works before going for a large study, including a lot of patients. In these first studies, patients with sarcoglycanopathy, so Limb-Girdle Muscular Dystrophy type 2D, were included. And here, the investigators performed an intramuscular injection in this small muscle of the foot. The idea was to demonstrate that the local injection was able to restore the expression of the protein. You can see here in the staining very nicely. And you can also see here that the before treatment and after treatment, this band. They also studied immune reaction, and they observed that injecting a virus, of course, can lead to an immune reaction either locally or systemically. So that is something that we need to deal with that. We learned that thanks to these experiments. And also all these preliminary studies eventually lead to the development of a clinical trial with systemic injection. They were successful, of course. They showed local benefits, but now we need to demonstrate that we can treat all muscles of the body. And for doing that, we need a systemic delivery. So there is an ongoing clinical trial with Limb-Girdle Muscular Dystrophy type 2E, which is beta sarcoglycanopathy. And this clinical trial is a phase 1. When we say phase 1, it's always about safety, that have enrolled a total of 6 patients. 3 patients have been treated with what we say a low dose of the virus, 3 patients have received a high dose of the virus. And patients, as you can see here, were young patients with Limb-Girdle Muscular Dystrophy 2B that have a genetic confirmation. They did not have antibodies against this virus, of course, because we don't want to have an immune reaction, and they were able to work almost more than 40% in a single work test. Patients received prednisone, steroids, to reduce the inflammation produced by the virus, and these are some of the results. So with the staining, you can clearly see here that we observe an increase in the expression of the protein in all the patients. And this increase was between 50 to 70% of the muscle fibers became protein producers, which is, of course, very good result. And then they analyzed the Western blot, those bands, that allows us to quantify how much protein this does mean. And they observed that there was between 30 and 60% expression of a normal protein. So again, a lot of protein. Your question could be, what happens with the muscle function of this patient? So there are only few data published so far, but these patients have been followed with the North NSAD, which is a scale that Meredith has developed here in Newcastle. And the authors or the investigators have released or have made public that patients are improving after 1 year of follow-up. We need much more data, of course. This is just 6 patients in a phase 1 clinical trial. But these good results are now bringing a phase 3 trial that will hopefully start very soon, probably next year, in many sites around the world, and hopefully also here in the UK. And we will be able to enroll patients and test if this approach is useful for this disease. We're talking about Limb-Girdle Muscular Dystrophy 2D, sorry. Sometimes I can hear that people say, oh, that treatment is for a different disease. It's not for my disease. I would like you to understand that this is a very important trial for all the Limb-Girdle Muscular Dystrophy community, for all the neuromuscular community, because being successful now with these first trials is crucial for the companies to develop new studies in all the Limb-Girdle Muscular Dystrophies. So if these studies fail at this step, early steps, then probably this strategy will be cancelled, and companies will not be interested in investing more money in this strategy. So that's the reason why a clinical trial in this disease is relevant to all Limb-Girdle Muscular Dystrophies and to all neuromuscular diseases. So Meredith has already presented Journey, which is a natural history study in sarcoglycanopathy. Of course, the company that is promoting this clinical trial wants to collect data on the natural history of this disease. So we are doing this natural history with patients with mutations in the sarcoglycan genes. It's a pretty easy study where we follow patients during 2 years. If you are interested, just contact us, and you can see my mail here. And this is just to show you that I have been talking about beta sarcoglycanopathy, but there are now gene therapy programs in the pipeline being developed for many diseases, for FKRP, for other sarcoglycans, for NO5, for dysferlin. So there are a lot of companies investing funding in developing these programs, but also some academic studies. So there are, however, many questions that needs to be solved for gene therapy. What happens with antibodies? So I have mentioned that some patients can have antibodies and they cannot participate in this trial. What happens if a second infusion is needed? Because we know that the expression of the protein over time can be limited, and probably we need a second infusion. Of course, patients that receive this virus develop antibodies, and they could probably not be included in these follow-up studies. What happened with the remaining muscle function? So it's the same to treat a patient that is very early in the progression of the disease, that treat a patient that is more advanced and it's almost in a wheelchair. Are we expecting the same response? We don't know. That's a reality. What happens with production and cost? How much this will cost to the health system? We know that the first drugs are very expensive. Is our health system going to be able to pay all these costs for patients with Limb-Girdle Muscular Dystrophies, with patients with neuromuscular diseases? Of course, this also needs to be discussed. and also the experience from the Duchenne field. So in Duchenne, there are many trials now with gene therapy, and Duchenne is also allowing us to learn a lot about the safety issues, the productivity issues, the main response that we can expect. So there are other ways to restore the protein expression that is not only gene therapy. And I would like to show you this slide. This is maybe a pretty complicated slide, but I will try to make it easy. As you know, there is a disease that is produced by mutations in one gene that is called FKRP. And this gene, this protein, what it does is to add sugars to another protein that is called alpha-dystroglycan. A group of researchers in the United States have demonstrated that if we treat animals, because this is a preclinical animal models, with one sugar called ribitol, and we give a lot of this sugar to the remaining FKRP present in the muscle, this remaining protein is able to put more sugars in the alpha-dystroglycan. And then it can happen that the protein is again functional and animals can improve. And they have demonstrated that with this ribitol, the amount of protein increases. You can see it here from non-treated to treated. And this is a normal animal. And you can see again the staining. You can see again all the bands here in the sarcoglycans, and an improvement in the muscle structure as well. And of course, as I said before, an improvement in the function. So the animals are able to run for longer, have more muscle strength. And this is becoming a new clinical trial that is going to start very soon as well. So restoring protein expression is not always genetic, can also be done through other strategies, and this can be a good one. Tackling inflammation. You may know about the corticoid experience. So in my life as a clinician, I have seen many patients with Limb-Girdle treated with corticoids. And this comes mainly from different observations. On the one hand, in some diseases, we can have inflammatory infiltrates. We can have inflammatory cells in the muscles. And this happens, for example, in dysferlin or anoctamin 5, where we can see these cells invading the muscle. It can happen also in other diseases like sarcoglycans or calpains, when we can have these macrophages, which are a type of inflammatory cells. So on the one hand, we have cells that are inflammatory that invade the muscles of patients with Limb-Girdle. And on the other hand, we have the experience from Duchenne. In Duchenne, patients are treated with prednisone because we try to decrease this inflammatory response, which is really increased in patients with Duchenne. And we know that prednisone is good for Duchenne boys because delay the disease progression. So in many times we have seen that patients with muscular dystrophies, Limb-Girdle muscular dystrophies, receive steroids because of these two reasons. The results in general are not very good. There are only some studies published in the literature trying to identify if steroids are good for patients with dysferlin, with sarcoglycans, with ANO5. And in most of the cases, what we can see is this kind of trend. So patients treated with corticoids or treated with placebo progress in the same way, and we don't see many differences. So in principle, steroids are not a good treatment for patients with Limb-Girdle muscular dystrophy. But the inflammatory pathway, the fact that there is inflammation, is leading to new research trying to identify anti-inflammatory drugs. For example, drugs like etanercept or drugs like edasalonexant that are tackling molecular pathways related with inflammation. All these drugs are being tested in preclinical animal models, and hopefully, if they succeed, they will move into clinical trials. And just to show you, there are now some clinical trials active, some of them trying to still test if steroids are good. For example, there is a trial in Limb-Girdle muscular dystrophy R9, which is FKRP. There are trials also in calpain, in dysferlin, etc. Some of them promoted by private companies like PTC Therapeutics, and some others academic studies like this one of the Northwestern University. Another interesting strategy is reducing fibrosis. As I mentioned before, when muscle fibers are lost, they are replaced by fibrosis. And fibrotic tissue is this thing that you can see here that is between the muscle fibers. I am showing you the muscle fiber, this pink thing or red thing, and you can see this tissue that is progressively replacing the muscle fibers, increasing in our muscle in patients with muscular dystrophies, and it does not have any contractile property. So it leads to muscle weakness. So there are plenty of drugs that have been investigated to know if they can be effective as antifibrotic. Unfortunately, most of these drugs have been only tested in preclinical animal models. For example, you can see here some studies. We did a study in patients with Duchenne. We have done a study in patients with sarcoglycan now. There are some studies done in dysferlin. There are other studies done in calpain, and there are no clinical trials active now. But this is another strategy that is being investigated by many pharma companies. And then I talk about increasing muscle tissue. So you may remember that maybe 15 years ago, stem cells was something really trendy, and everybody was talking about the stem cells are going to cure the disease. The main idea with the stem cell was to restore the number of muscle fibers, increase the muscle tissue, and bring a healthy copy of the gene to these muscle fibers. Unfortunately, this strategy failed, and so far there are not many new strategies in this field. But of course, there is still a lot of research in some groups trying to identify a stem cell that can effectively increase the amount of muscle in patients that are in more advanced situations. I have just mentioned these strategies. I want to show you this last slide. You can see here many different strategies that are also tested. For example, this drug ADG5506, that is a stabilizer of the muscle that is being tested in Becker. This edalonexant is the anti-inflammatory drug. Nandrolone, it's being tested in some Limb-Girdle Muscular Dystrophy models. Nocadathol as well. So you can see here many companies are testing different drugs in preclinical animal models, so in mice. And with this, I want to convince you that there is a lot of research going on trying to identify a cure for these diseases. Meredith had talked about this. I'm not going to insist. We need really good outcome measure. And these are muscle function tests, muscle MRI biomarkers, because we need to know if these drugs are effective. But we also need natural history studies to better understand what is the progression, the normal progression of these diseases. So as a summary, there is a lot of research in the development of new treatments for Limb-Girdle Muscular Dystrophies. Gene delivery seems promising, but I think that there are still a lot of questions that need to be solved. Treatments for Limb-Girdle Muscular Dystrophy are several times based in the pathophysiology of Duchenne, and this is leading to null results, and it is true. We need to know more about the difference between Limb-Girdles and Duchenne. It's not the same than Duchenne than many of the Limb-Girdles, and it's not the same the natural history of Duchenne than the natural history of many Limb-Girdles. So we need to know and to study the natural history of these diseases to develop better outcome measures and to know what we can expect. And this is my last slide. I just want to thank you for your attention. This is my mail, the mail of the university, and this is my Twitter account if you are interested in following me. Thank you very much for your attention.
Wow, thank you, Jordi and Meredith. They were fantastic talks, and it's really great to see that there are so many potential treatments being investigated out there, and hopefully then there will be some that will come through to the clinic and so that people can access in the coming years. We've already received a number of questions, and we've had some questions in the chat. I'm mindful of time, so we might have to rattle through these a little bit, but I'd love to be able to talk to you a little bit about some of these. Somebody has asked about RNA-seq, which is sequencing RNA, and whether this has been a successful study. I think that maybe there's a study being carried out in Newcastle on RNA-seq. I don't know whether, Jordi, you're involved in it or not. Do you know anything about that? And also the person who asked the question perhaps was actually involved in the study and would quite like to know how they can find out their data, if that's possible. You may not be able to answer that.
Yes, of course. So RNA-seq, it's a diagnostic technology. It's a technology that is, what it does is to sequence the RNA that is present in the cells. And the idea is that try to find mutations. Sometimes most of the times we find the mutations in the DNA using Sanger sequencing or panels, exons. But sometimes it's difficult with these technologies, and there are some mutations that can be what we call the hidden mutation. So we need to find them. And a good way to do it is to sequence the RNA. And when we say RNA-seq, is sequencing RNA to find a mutation and confirm a diagnosis. So I don't know about this particular patient. So we have RNA-seq studies here in Newcastle. Some of them were academic studies, but now RNA-seq is also in the pipeline for the diagnostic in the NHS. So I have shared my email. I'm happy if you want to share my email with this person. I'm happy to know where the data, whatever he or she needs.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Now, Judy, you've been speaking a lot about some of the studies that are ongoing. It's probably a little bit difficult to say exactly when they could, if and when they could lead to a treatment itself being available. But I mean, something that's now currently, for example, in a phase 1 trial, how long do you think it could be before that could be actually, available on the NHS?
That's a $1 million question. It's always ask this question. It's very difficult to answer. So it depends on the results of the study. It depends also in the safety, of course. So for example, with gene therapy in Duchenne, most of the studies started more than 5 years ago, and they are still as clinical trials. They have not finished. And the main reason is because these studies are finding some difficulties in terms of safety. Every time that there is a safety problem, safety issue, the studies are stopped and need the FDA or the NIS here, whatever, the pharmacological authorities to review the data before giving the green light again and allowing them to finish the trial. If everything goes fine, I mean, with this, I mean a trial that start and finish without any problem and show a clear response in the patients, this can be actually very quick. For example, in SMA, the companies needed less than 5 years since they started the trial until the drug was commercialized. The main reason was because they demonstrated that the treatment was saving lives. And therefore, it was very quick to a safety and saving lives. And therefore, the treatment arrived to the market in a very short period of time. But it's not always that way. It can take more than 10 and sometimes more than 15 years just the clinical development.
Thank you. And leading on from that, even once you get to that stage of showing that something is clinically effective, you still, as you mentioned, you have to go through the NICE phases. Now, I'm going to put my colleague Rob on the spot here because he's been involved in a lot of our interactions with NICE around a number of other conditions, and he could maybe just give a very brief mention of sort of how long that process can take. So, Rob.
Thanks, Kate. We'll pick this up later, this hospital pass. And yeah, I mean, it's a real challenge for all patient groups, and I presume also shared with professionals as well, in terms of that the longevity of that process, how long it takes. So it's several years from inception into the NICE process through to a final outcome, and it can be even longer than that if something called a managed access agreement is factored in as well. So I guess to break it down a bit, from our perspective as a patient organisation, we will be notified that NICE is mindful to develop guidance on a treatment, and will be invited to participate in that process. The process starts with what's called a scoping phase, where NICE explore what that treatment would effectively provide for people, and what it should be given for, or who it should be given to. And then up to a year later, the actual consultation will begin, and that's where clinical expertise, the company producing the treatment, patient groups such as Muscular Dystrophy UK will feed in our view on the treatment. There's then another long pause of several months before then that comes into an actual committee meeting, where for the first time the committee will discuss the treatment. There's then another period of a few months as they sort of look at that evidence and they come to that. There's a period called technical engagement, where lots more evidence is fed in, and then you'll have a kind of an outcome from that phase. That at that point they may what's called a draft recommendation. That's where we're at with several treatments at the moment, and then there can be another consultation, unless at that stage NICE say yes, we should approve this for use. There might then be another consultation, which then several months later again is the final committee meeting. So the reason I haven't given a timescale is because those timescales are very elastic, but it's at least a couple of years, probably, from us receiving notification that NICE want to look at something to any kind of sort of final guidance. And as I say, increasingly in the rare disease space, things called a managed access agreement are being used, which is where NICE effectively say we think this treatment has efficacy and is certainly safe. It won't have got to the NICE stage unless that's been shown already, but NICE effectively say we think this is something that we would want to give a recommendation on, but we don't have enough evidence yet. So actually we want to make it available to people for usually 5 years while we collect further data, and then we'll make a final decision. And that's where we're at with treatments like Translana. We're partway through a managed access agreement on an SMA treatment called Spinraza at the moment. And I'm sure that we will see more of those in the neuromuscular space moving forward.
Thank you. So to answer the question from our questioner, unfortunately, it's a very long time, but there are lots and lots of points at which there need to be very rigorous checks and balances right from the very beginning of the process when we're looking at animal models through to the early phases and the later phases of the clinical trial, and then getting it through approval. So it's a long process, but it's incredibly important to make sure that everything is safe and effective, which is obviously very, very important. So moving on to another question here, someone was diagnosed with something called hang on, I need to make this, sorry, to make the text a bit bigger. Myotubulin-based myofibrillar myopathy in 2008. And they were told this is similar to Limb-Girdle type 1A, which is on the old nomenclature system. Are the conditions different, and is there any research into this particular type of limb-girdle? Maybe Geordie, you could answer that one.
I was mute. So yes, it's a similar. It's a myofibrillar myopathy, and there are some studies now ongoing with myofibrillar myopathy. Just for everybody to understand, in myofibrillar myopathy, what happens is that this all the system in the muscle fibers, which is a lot of proteins there, is disrupted, and these proteins are accumulated inside the muscle fibers, and then they did not allow the muscle fibers to contract, and the muscle fibers can end up dying, as happened with muscular dystrophies. So yes, there is still a lot of research, but it's a pretty complicated disease to treat. And the main reason is because these are what we call dominant diseases. So dominant diseases means that in any generation of the family, there is a member with this disease. And in these dominant diseases, there is one healthy copy of the gene already, and one copy that is disrupted. And gene therapy, then it makes not too much sense because there is already one healthy copy. And there is a problem with a bad copy that is producing a protein that is not working well. So there is still research in these dominant diseases, although whatever, A, B, C, D, but the reality is that we are still a bit far away from finding something that can work.
Thank you very much. This is a really interesting question, and something I confess I've never really thought about, but the treatments that are undergoing clinical trials at the moment, do you think that they would be suitable for people with a lactose or dairy allergy? I mean, do some of the injections perhaps come with things that are, coming
so far,
from dairy?
We haven't seen that as an exclusion criteria for the trials, so I don't think that's going to be a problem.
Brilliant, that's fantastic. And then some of the questions that are coming through from today, and perhaps Meredith, you might be able to know this, whether there'll be a natural history study for LGMD 2A coming through.
Okay, so that's calpainopathy 2A, or now known as R1. So if you see R1 popping up, that's you if you've got calpainopathy. We are part of a global group called the GRASP Consortium, who are in a natural history study that is looking at calpainopathy. And at the moment, that's being run in the USA. But in addition to that, within our clinic in Newcastle, we are doing ongoing data collection whereby we're looking at the assessments that we've developed and how they're working for all the limb-girdle subtypes. And so hopefully we'll be able to do some analysis as we continue with that work just clinically and alongside with some of our collaborators who also collect that information clinically.
Fantastic, brilliant, thank you. Really great question here from a physiotherapist based in Oxford, who says that their limb-girdle patients ask a lot about clinical trials. However, inclusion criteria for a lot of clinical trials seem to be that people have to be able to be mobile, walking, and sort of, I suppose, have a higher functioning, if you like. Why is this? And do you think that there will be trials that are going to be perhaps more inclusive to people who perhaps are already wheelchair users? I don't know who wants to come in.
I don't know. I can answer. Or Meredith, do you want to answer, or do you want me to answer?
You start.
Okay, so yes, that's true. The main reason is because the studies. So these studies, the clinical trials, are very expensive. That's the reality. So organizing a trial for a company, it's a lot of money, and they need to demonstrate that the drug has an effect, because in general is what we say, they have just one bullet, right? They need to demonstrate that the drug is useful and it has an impact in muscle function. So for that, including patients that are in a more advanced stage of the disease can mean that the drug is effective, but it's more hard to identify that effect. The main reason could be because we don't have as good outcome measure for the upper limbs as we have for the lower limbs, or we have not investigated it too much. Maybe Meredith can talk more about this. But the main reason is because of that. I have to say that in some diseases, we are starting to have clinical trials for patients that are wheelchair, for example. In Pompe, we have seen this. Some of the studies are including patients that are in a wheelchair. In Duchenne, there are some planned studies for patients that are in the wheelchair, and hopefully this will be also the case for all of them. Meredith, do you agree with me?
Yep, exactly all of those things. And I think we are learning, particularly from Duchenne, where all the original studies were all in boys who could walk, but walking is something that's time limited, and there's a lot more time of life that can be spent not walking. And so for Limb-Girdle, we had the learning from Duchenne, which meant that when we were looking at what tests to use in Limb-Girdle, that we were already on making sure that we were capturing upper limb function and the patient voice with our outcome measures, so that when the trials come, we've got something appropriate for everybody with their own experience of Limb-Girdle.
Fantastic, thank you. Rob, you've put your hand up.
I have, rather dangerously, to head off being ambushed, I guess. I think it's just very interesting here that the evolution of what we look at in clinical trials, I think, is we're experiencing that again in terms of the how nice to look at things. I think because you can measure ambulation and movement in the verticals more easily, he says, knowing there are people on the panel who've spent a lot of time working out how to measure that robustly. At the beginning, as we were seeing treatments come through, so right in the early days of Translarna and Spinraza, there was a real focus on the stopping criteria, i.e. when someone stops being on that treatment, being around ambulation. Actually, now we're seeing from NICE bigger or wider acceptance that there are benefits beyond ambulation, and actually a bit of a view that they need to factor that in as well. But so I think it's a really important theme in neuromuscular diseases, because actually we are moving, I think, beyond. There's a broader acceptance across the piece. I think that there is benefit beyond ambulation, and that is crucial to a patient. I think one patient who fed into our Translarna response made the point that actually for them, now they're in a wheelchair, they feel their treatment is ensuring they can still use their hand and particularly their fingers to manipulate objects and move around. Actually for them, that is losing that function would have a far bigger impact, they said, on their quality of life than actually becoming non-ambulant would have done in retrospect. So it's a really interesting one that we I think all areas are keen to explore further, I think.
Thank you. I wasn't going to ambush you, but thank you. Just a couple more, because they're kind of linked to one another. Are there any research studies into limb-girdle R19 in 2T in the olden parlance? I'm very good for that person to know both types. I'm very impressed. And I suppose leading on for that, are there any for R19, but are there also any for other subtypes coming down the pipeline?
Yes, R19 is the MPPV, which is a relatively new protein. And I have to say that in some of these patients already can benefit from a treatment, which is mestinon, which is pyridostigmine, because this is a drug that we use for myasthenia. But some of the patients with this disease can have some clinical features similar to myasthenia, mainly fatigue and fatigability, because we need to distinguish. One thing is being fatigued, which is what can happen to everybody, and fatigability means that your muscle weakness worsens clearly when you do an exercise, which is something that only happens in patients with this disease called myasthenia, congenital myasthenic syndrome. So GMPPV patients can have involvement of, can have similar signs and can benefit from mestinon. Not all of them, a part of them. And in terms of therapies, well, this is a relatively new disease. So there is still research, and I know that there are some academic groups investigating potential cure for this disease that goes through gene therapy as well. But as far as I know, that there is not a clinical trial. And for all these new diseases, so I think it's important to also know that, yes, in general, there is always an academic group working. But some of the limb-girdles are affected, are what we consider ultra-rare diseases. Mm-hmm. And ultra-rare diseases means that they affect just a minority of patients. So in general, all limb-girdles are rare, but ultra-rare means just a few patients in the world. So for companies, sometimes investing money in a treatment that will be effective for 2-3 patients in each country is not enough appealing, and therefore, in these cases, we need to find a way to be able to develop a treatment with public funding, with public investors. And of course, this means that, of course, these patients deserve to receive a treatment. Of course, that there is not a discussion about that. But can be difficult to find a way to develop the treatment, and is where the public investors have a lot to say. Because it's where we need to, using the technology that is now being developed by many companies, use this technology and apply it to patients with ultra-rare diseases. And probably we need to find a way to identify this treatment for these rare populations.
Thank you very much. And I think that brings us to our final question, which is, for those people who have a diagnosis of limb-girdle muscular dystrophy but don't have a genetic diagnosis, are they likely to be eligible for clinical trials?
That's an excellent question. So the answer is yes. I have presented here today a lot of strategies, right? I mean, that's the point. So gene therapy is based on knowing what is the gene that is mutated. And that, so patients without a genetic diagnosis will not be able to participate in a gene therapy strategy. The good thing about the other treatments, inflammatory treatments or antifibrotics, is that they can tackle this process, which is not, we know it affects many patients, and we probably don't need them to have a final diagnosis, or they could have different diagnoses. I mean, in an antifibrotic trial, we could treat patients with sarcoglycan, patients with calpain, etc. We always want to have homogeneous patients to understand what is the response. But the main reason is, the main answer to the question would be, an antifibrotic that works for calpain can probably work for dysferlin, and can also probably work for a disease that we don't know the diagnosis, but we know that there is also fibrosis there. So it's too early to say if these patients will be recruited to trials, but they could be treated with these approaches. The answer is yes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Meredith, I suppose for natural history studies, is it more difficult if you don't have that genetic diagnosis, or is that also something you look at?
Well, even without the genetic diagnosis, the disease is still having an impact on people. So clinically, we need to make sure that they're still accessing the same care that anybody else that does have a genetic diagnosis has. Clinically, that it's this, for us in our clinic, it's the same assessments and the same follow-up. And certainly when we're collating our own clinical data with other sites, there is those patients without a genetic diagnosis are still included in that data analysis as well. And certainly, within the genetics team in Newcastle, there's always there's new genes being found, there's new processes for analysing DNA, and that work is ongoing. So for people without a genetic diagnosis, there's still work in the background to try and continue to find a cause for their disease.
Fantastic, thank you. Geordie, Meredith, thank you both so much for your time and your the answers to your questions. It's been fantastic and fascinating. I hope you'll be able to stay for the next panel if you can. I appreciate we're taking your time. So I'm going to hand back to Rob now to talk about the Living With session with the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. And yeah, thanks everybody. That was a fascinating discussion. I've realised I'm in the MDUK office and we have motion sensitive lights and mine have just turned off. So apologies, I'm half in shadow. When I next have a break, I'll wave off camera to try and get the light back on. So yeah, as Kate said, we're now moving into our kind of Living With Limb-Girdle Muscular Dystrophy section. I'm delighted to introduce some fresh speakers. I'm actually going to just give the panel a quick warning. I know that Hayley has to leave us at 2:45, so I'll introduce Hayley and Jenny first, and then ask a question about sort of physiotherapy and LGMD, and then introduce Rachel and Martin after that, just so we make sure we've definitely heard from Hayley before she has to leave us. So Jenny Sheehan is a clinical specialist paediatric physiotherapist at Evelina London Children's Hospital. She has over 30 years experience of working in neuromuscular disorders, mostly in paediatrics, but some adult work as well. Jenny runs physiotherapy only neuromuscular clinics, as well as being part of a multidisciplinary team clinic with 3 consultants, and also runs outreach clinics. Jenny is involved in teaching and service development and was one of the developers and authors of the North Star functional assessment for DMD, which is why actually joined the call literally as I was saying that measuring ambulation and mobility was fairly straightforward, and I suddenly panicked because I know very well it isn't, and she may have a right of reply on that to comment. And Hayley Davis is an adult specialist neuromuscular physiotherapist covering South East Wales. She's been working within the neuromuscular service for 3 years, supporting people with a range of different neuromuscular diseases, and has 15 years experience in neurological rehabilitation. So Jenny and Hayley, if I could come to you two first, then just we hear a lot in the Muscle Matters seminar series about the importance of the team that's built around people living with the conditions and the many aspects of help. And Rachel, as a care advisor, we'll talk about that shortly. And there's a whole range of people who are part of that team. What would be great is just hearing from you guys, why is physiotherapy so important for someone with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, and kind of what role do you play within that team? And I guess if we go to start from childhood onwards, so if I come to you first, Jenny, and then Hayley, you sort of come in on the adult side, if that's okay.
Yep, that's fine. Yes, so at Evelina we run multidisciplinary team clinics and physio-only clinics. So we do standardized assessments, but the whole reason for doing that is to see how we can help the individual with limb-girdle. So we do functional assessments. We're also looking at range of movement. We're looking at the spine. We're looking at gait. We're looking at wheelchairs, and we're looking at how we can help to gain the most functional ability, which is the most important thing. And it's a little bit harder in children to know what they want. It's much more about what the parents want. So that can be a bit tricky. We are trying to maintain ambulation, but equally we are encouraging use of powered wheelchair if that's the best way to promote independence. So a lot of it is about maintenance of maintaining their muscle power. And we don't give huge programs of strengthening exercises. We might do some, if one particular muscle group is causing a functional problem, we might direct exercise there. We do promote stretching of joints and explaining why, because contractures are painful. They affect symmetry, they affect gait. So everything, all the information that we collect is in order to help the child and direct them forwards. So that's what we do. We see children from 0 to 18, and I also do a transition clinic with our adult neurologists. So we try and see them once and hand over, highlighting what the main problems are and what current goals are and how we can help. So at the end of every appointment, we liaise with the community service. So in paediatrics, not so great in adults, I think. Paediatrics is usually a community physio involved, and we liaise with them because they might have only seen one child with limb-girdle in their caseload. So we're directing them as to how to move forwards.
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, and moving to you, Hayley, in terms of what would be interesting is if you wouldn't mind talking about that transition. I know you work in different services, but the transition that takes place between pediatrics into your adult sort of side, Hayley, and yeah, just how that kind of grows out into how the service grows into adulthood and supporting adults with the condition.
Sure, we probably work quite similarly, where we have sort of transitional meetings. So I do tend to do like a physiotherapy specific handover as well with the pediatric physiotherapist, and then we have other transitions to sort of the medical teams, or if they need specialist respiratory type services. They may also be involved with sort of local physiotherapists as well, so sort of linking in and having handovers from pediatric teams that aren't specialist neuromuscular as well. And then in the adult service, similarly, we do sort of annual MDT reviews where Rachel, myself, and our neurologist will tend to be there. So that's an opportunity to see if there's any changes. So that's where we'll do our sort of functional assessments, do muscle strengthening, look if there's any changes in needs of equipment, anything that's more of a struggle. And we can sort of advise from there, or if they need sort of further input from a physiotherapy point of view, we can do that a home visit if it's something more sort of home based, or we can offer physiotherapy outpatient courses if sort of needed. It may be that they want to see sort of more local physio teams. So if that's the case, if they're getting more involved with generic services, then we can provide that specialist support for them to know a bit more about the sort of conditions. But I think it's a lot around sort of pacing and getting the right kind of intensity of exercise, not overworking sort of vulnerable weak muscles, and just giving that specialist advice to where they should be grading their exercise and making it quite individual to what the patient's needs are. So we'll see patients from different stages of their disease, at different variety of different ages as well.
Thank you. I'm going to continue abusing the format because we've had a couple of questions that have come in specifically on physiotherapy, and actually linked to that point you're just making then about exercise. So the question is, can exercise help to keep muscle from deteriorating, or is over exercising causing the muscle fiber to get more damaged? Like I guess that you sort of talked about pacing, but it's probably the answer's probably in the middle, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So with the muscles that are particularly weak and vulnerable as part of the disease process, you don't want to be overworking them, and you're right, they are at risk of injury from overworking. So we sort of talk about sort of if they're able to resist gravity, that kind of things, what kind of level are those muscles at, and sort of maintaining them. We wouldn't advise any sort of only sort of moderate work for sort of muscles, and also optimizing those that aren't as affected. So those that are going to be sort of maybe sort of more core muscles, and keeping those to help with sort of functional status of different patients.
Right, thank you. And then yeah, linked to that then, are there sort of specific beneficial exercises, or is it really down to the patient, each patient individually, and that's part of your role, Jenny and Hayley, to kind of advise on the individual need?
I would say it's definitely down to individual needs. So we know the pattern of muscle weakness, but every child and every adult is different, and what they're wanting to do and the functional things that they're wanting to do are different. So it really needs to be an individualized program of exercise and activity as well, because the other thing that we are still trying to encourage is aerobic exercise, as we should all do something in that way. It's finding the right one for the child. So it might be swimming, it might be wheelchair football. So all of those activities are also exercise, and it's finding the right thing for the right person.
Great, thank you. And before I finally bring in Rachel and Martin, Meredith, obviously we're beneficial to have 3 physiotherapists on the panel. So have you got anything to add to anything Hayley and Jenny have just said in that aspect?
No, in total agreement. So when we're in clinic doing assessments, we should be measuring for management, so we can see what the patient's main concern is at that visit and what we can do to help. And onward referrals, particularly for limb-girdle, and is having the right wheelchair, having the right equipment and aids at home, discussions about orthotic use, and for patients to have access to an orthotist if they are ambulant and they're looking at a splint that might help with some of the fatigue by something like a carbon fiber splint might be appropriate. We're lucky enough not to have too much transition. We have the same team for pediatrics and adults in Newcastle, and we run an MDT as well. And in terms of exercise, it is completely an individualized prescription. We do need to think about our cardiovascular fitness of all of our patients with limb-girdle. Those government guidance about keeping your heart and lungs fit apply to you as well, but it's finding a method of exercising that is enjoyable and possible, so that it can become a habit for our patients. And it doesn't necessarily mean going to the gym. You know, we can be very creative.
Thank you very much. Spoiler in terms of following Martin on Facebook and on Twitter, that I think you're into boxing, Martin, aren't you, at the time? So we'll come back to that in a second. So I will now introduce Rachel and Martin, and then come to them for a contribution for going into our broader questions. So Rachel Salmon is a neuromuscular family care advisor, also covering South East Wales, and she covers the paediatric and the adult service. Her background is as a registered nurse, but she also has qualifications in genetics, and she's the coordinator of newborn screening program in Wales for Duchenne muscular dystrophy for 8 years, and she's been supporting families living with muscular dystrophies for around 12 years. Martin Highwood he remains a member of the MDUK community, but he's also now a member of the MDUK staff team. So he is our corporate new businesses officer. But 23 years ago, at the age of 23, good alignment there, was diagnosed with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, and as well as working for MDUK, has been a prolific fundraiser for us, as well as an advocacy ambassador and providing peer support. So thank you and welcome to both of you. Rachel, in the same way I asked that first question to Jenny and Hayley, it'd be great just to hear a bit about the role of a care advisor and how you support individuals and families sort of living with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy.
Okay, well, I'd like to say good afternoon to everybody, panelists and attendees. My role is quite varied. As, due to my background, I probably work more as a CNS in the roles that I carry out, supporting the paediatric and the adult sectors. So I'm involved from diagnosis, where it'll be in the paediatric or the adult sector. And at that time of diagnosis, I'm quite instrumental in ensuring the understanding of the condition, the genetic inheritance pattern of the condition, to provide information and support to families. Along the way, obviously, it's a holistic approach, and we do MDT clinics in the paediatric sector and the adult sector. And I also do transitional clinics with palliative care and the cardiorespiratory teams in South East Wales. So it's trying to support the families as best we can, really, bringing in a holistic assessment, looking at all the activities of living to try and maintain a quality of life, however that may look for them in the landscape of where they are in the disease. Also trying to manage the condition proactively. So from early diagnosis, obviously, all the way through, because obviously I see them all the way through, looking at if any adaptations need to be done to their home, to the workplace, looking at them in a timely fashion. To obviously manage anxieties as well. Look at from a medical point of view, it's looking at some things like continence and managing cardiac and respiratory issues, getting the right teams involved at the right time and signposting to the appropriate services. Also, which I think is very instrumental, is we do support sessions and conferences for families, which have been greatly beneficial to meet others in the same position. Even if sometimes they may be in a group with other conditions, they have issues which are quite similar. So it's about problem solving there as well. So it's quite a variable role, and obviously providing education as well to schools and the workplace. That's part of my role, to support the families. And a huge component of the role is emotional well-being and psychological support. That's where we're trying to lobby for more psychological support. So at least we're doing the support sessions and the peer information and support there. We're trying to counteract that as well.
Great, thank you, Rachel. And this may be my observation of the care advisor role is that the majority of care advisors seem to have come from either a nursing background or an occupational therapy background. Is that right? How does someone become a care advisor?
Right, well, historically, so like I said, my background is registered general nurse on cardiothoracic, but then I did my degree in genetics and PGC, and I run the newborn screening programme in Wales. We were one of only 3 centres in the world that screened for Duchenne. So I was particularly interested because when I was picking up the Duchenne, I had nowhere, whereas if I was picking up CF, PKU, CHD, I had some specialist nurses to refer them on to. Within Duchenne, there was no one to refer on to. So at the time, Lynn Mum was in MDUK. So they were the ones who actually employed the care advisors at that time. So I'm talking 16 years ago now. So we put a business case in to support families within Wales. And because of the variability of the role, it was deemed, rather than putting a CNS role out, care advisors could attract people from different backgrounds. So at that time, they were social workers, midwives, OTs, physios. It was very varied, and nurses who was doing the role of a care advisor. And obviously that brings different skill sets to the role. Within our setting, because of the development of care pathways, for example, emergency steroid management, etc., it's more of a CNS role here.
Great, thank you. Martin, I always like coming to the real person on the panel last because I quite like giving you the chance to reflect back on what you've heard from the professionals involved in the condition. So it'd be great to hear about the sort of journey you've been on with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, and also, yeah, reflecting on any of the sort of the things you've heard about the management of the condition and the support that's in place for people about that really chimes with you and what you found most useful.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. So I'll give a bit of a potted history about myself, but then I do want to actually go back to a couple of things that have been said, especially by Hayley and Jenny just then, and also Meredith. But so I left school at 15 years old. It was a Friday. I got my exam results. I was 15, and my mum got me on a bus, and I went to a job interview to be a car mechanic, and I got it that afternoon, and I started work on the Monday. So I've always been extremely hard working, and so I started in the motor trade, and I was good at it, you know. And then at the age of 23, I got headhunted and promoted to a main dealership in my local town. And within a couple of weeks, I had an accident in the workshop and dislocated my right knee, and it wasn't getting better in the time that we were supposed to get better. And then I went from to Stoke Mandeville Hospital, and then eventually ended up seeing Dr. David Hilton Jones at Oxford, who gave myself and my brother the diagnosis of limb-girdle muscular dystrophy after a biopsy. And I have 2 other brothers, and they are not affected by the condition. So my GP said that the chances are I wouldn't be able to work as a car mechanic anymore. So I took that knowledge, I can imagine many people here today I was extremely angry with my diagnosis. But I knew that I needed to do something to help myself and others. So I took my motor vehicle engineering experience, and I went to work for Volkswagen. I started there as a delivery driver, and I worked my way up to fleet car sales for the whole of the UK. So then I took that experience of office etiquette, how to speak to people, and I went to work for an IT company. And again, it was entry-level administration on 12 grand a year, and worked my way up in that company to be the buyer, the purchaser for the whole company. And we were working on supercomputers for universities, blue light, and government and educational authorities. These were a big deal. So then I took that IT experience and went to work for a pharmaceutical company, and I was working on clinical trials. As Meredith mentioned earlier, I was connecting people around the globe for many different clinical trials for epilepsy and stroke and many different cancers. And then one day I was working on a muscular dystrophy trial, and I thought I'd made it. You know, this is where I wanted to be in my life. But all the while, my wife was seeing diagnosis stories within the community and from the Target MDUK magazine that we were being sent. And we could see the transformational funding and research the charity was doing. The advocacy service they offered my family was fantastic. And the helpline funded by the supporters was a godsend to my wife. So we started fundraising, and I started to walk a mile for muscles, which when I could hardly walk at all. And we did 1 mile and raised £1,000. And today, after the London Marathon this weekend, our family has gone on to raise £242,000, nearly £250,000. So my wife said it to me in December of 2019. She said, you should do this for a living. You should be a fundraiser for a living. So I gave up the security and safety of the job in pharmaceutical industry, and thought I'd have a bit of a sabbatical. And then in March, as everyone knows, we were all locked down. So I had no job. And during this period of lockdown and shielding, I sadly lost the ability to walk because I had no opportunity for exercise because I was simply a vulnerable person that had to be locked down and shielded. So that was quite a dark part of my life. But then this opportunity came along to be a regional corporate new business officer, and I went for the interview against many other fundraisers, and I got it, and here I am today. And now I work at MDUK. You know, I have lived experience and feel that I'm working in the best place to help myself and others. And I am here for any questions as well. And if it's not today on this panel, then you can contact me at m.highwood@musculardystrophyuk.org. But I would just like to say that it was fantastic hearing what people were saying today, because people with limb-girdle do often feel that we're the ones that get left behind. So it's fantastic to hear that there is things happening, there is things going on. But I just on the physiotherapy side of things, you know, I was in a place where I didn't want anyone's help. It wasn't for me. I couldn't find the right physio to help me in the right way. You know, and then I got so lucky with a friend that runs a dojo and extremely qualified in many different martial arts, and he invites me to go along there for free when usually a PT could be 50 to 100 pounds an hour. So I do consider myself extremely lucky. But I do sit down boxing, and I crawl to stand with the help of his help, because I think it's important that so I have quite a lot of falls. So I think it's important that I know how to recover and get myself up to standing again, if possible. If not, just a seat on the sofa. So we practice that in the dojo, as well as the boxing that I talked about, the sit-down boxing, and also being in the wheelchair, because when I'm in my wheelchair, my power chair, I'm using my core muscles. So I think it's important to tell people that we are working when we're in our chairs as well. But what one thing I really wanted to touch on that is massively important to me, considering the roller coaster I've been on, is when I come out of the gym, what I've done physically pops off in my brain like you would not believe. My mental health goes through the roof, because you know, it's living with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy sometimes is extremely painful, extremely exhausting, and we constantly have to get up every single day. It takes a lot to get up and get out of bed. So I think we need to take care of our mental health as well as our physical. And I think sometimes when we do some of the physical, that takes care of the mental as well. And you know, I cannot express enough how well I feel after doing some simple exercises. Sometimes it's rapid, you know, pad work and boxing, and sometimes I'm too exhausted to do that, and it's just movement and stretching and pulling a rope across a gym, things like that. Even the smallest little things can peak your mental health. So I cannot recommend it enough. Yeah, and that's about it for me. But and Geordie, thank you so much for your in-depth information. It was fantastic to hear that.
Thanks, Martin. And before I go back out to the rest of the panel, just another question for you, actually. In your role as an advocacy ambassador, what do you find, this may not be an answer to this question, but what are the sort of common things that other people with limb-girdle ask you about as someone living with the condition, and kind of what are their kind of, from an advocacy perspective, what kind of support do you sort of find yourself signposting them to, and then themes of the discussions?
Yeah, so sometimes it's benefits, sometimes it's what we're entitled to. I've just gone through the WAV process myself. So if anybody's out there and they're a bit wary of that or would like to inquire about that, then I've just gone through that, so I can give some guidance on that. Sometimes, you know, it's just somebody to talk to. Somebody will send me an email and they've recently received a diagnosis, or they might have received a diagnosis 15 years ago, and they've never ever spoken to somebody that lives with the same condition as you, and you speak the same language. You say, oh, I often trip, or I often fall, or I put certain grab rails in my house to stop, so my muscle memory knows where to go and what to do. So you have the safety of that. Sometimes it can be a guidance on a toilet stepper, you know, you're not too far along the line where you need a height adjust toilet in home, but how do I go about getting the stepper? You know, some things are simple, some things are, you know, people really reaching out for help and assistance. And like I said about the mental health side of things as well, that really comes into play with a lot of people as well, you know, and it's not always people living with the condition either. It's sometimes a partner of someone living with the condition. You know, my partner was diagnosed and they're you know, really down on themselves. How could I possibly help them? So it's them conversations as well. But it's extremely rewarding, by the way, to be an advocacy ambassador and to help others in the same predicament as myself is extremely rewarding.
Thanks, Martin. I'm going to go back out to the rest of the panel and pick up on one thing Martin said, which is around the progression of his condition during lockdown. We explored that as MDUK through our Shining Light report, and certainly picked up a sense that people were very worried their conditions have progressed as a result of lockdown, and then also some fear of that from the clinical community as well. Just really interested to hear your thoughts as whether that is something you're now seeing and how you're supporting people through that. I got lots of people who could answer this question, so anyone who wants to pitch in first, feel free. That's terrible chairing. Jenny, yes, please, you put your hand up. Thank you for saving me.
That's all right. Yes, I definitely we have noticed that. I just wanted to say actually before that when Martin was talking about the importance of mental health related to exercise, I completely agree with that. I have a lovely video of a child that I did a home visit. She was 13, I think at the time, was in a really foul mood because she had a horrible day at school and she did not want physio. And I did some upper limb sling suspension work with her, and the change in her face as she does it and she starts to enjoy it and she starts to feel better was huge, and it completely changed her mood in 5 minutes. So I just want to say I completely agree with Martin from that point of view. In terms of lockdown, definitely we have seen a deterioration with children not going to school, not accessing their normal activities, many not even leaving the house. You know, when we were saying you can go out for a walk, find a safe place to go outside where you're away from other people. But we're definitely seeing the impact of that now. Certainly some who lost their walking during that period. And then the knock-on effects of that of suddenly needing more equipment, suddenly needing a different wheelchair. And yes, certainly a huge impact.
And Haley, can I come to you next? Because I'm conscious we're going to lose you shortly from the panel. So it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I think in the adult service, we've seen a similar sort of thing. So I know during lockdown, like there are patients who'd been using pools and were very reliant on that and keeping that activity. And so when leisure centres closed, they lost that kind of access. But yeah, we do have people come into clinics saying that they've noticed a deterioration. During lockdown, we did try to reach out to people. We were available for sort of virtual things and sort of appointments to give them sort of programs, things they might be able to do at home. But yeah, unfortunately, and we do have some people who still are a bit anxious about getting out as well, so it's still sort of ongoing a little bit as well, and some people who still aren't wanting to come for their MDT clinics, and we're doing those the telephone and things. Are you on mute?
Honestly, my chairing has gone out the window. Meredith, Geordie or Rachel, have you got anything to add on that?
Very similar experience for both our adults and our kids. You know, lockdown was extremely difficult for the community, and even when restrictions were lifted, you know, people were understandably incredibly nervous about leaving the home. We've been doing MDT remote clinics, and we still have, whilst most of our clinical workers returned face-to-face, we still do have some remote options for patients who are still very concerned about coming out and coming to a busy hospital. And it's been extremely difficult for all of our patients, and the knock-on effect, you know, not only with leisure centre, hydrotherapy is something that is so difficult to access as it is, and then to have pools closed for so long and quite a lot of them quite slow in opening up, if there was even one available, means that we do need to be creative in what we can do in terms of exercise in the home environment as well.
Great, thank you.
Nothing from my side, Rob. I think everything has been said. I think it's just a demonstration that exercise is very important to keep muscle in patients with muscular diseases.
Great, thank you. I'll move us on to, we've got a set of questions that span, ones that have just come into the Q&A, but also questions in advance that are around upper body movement, and actually sort of linking to the conversation we had earlier around kind of measuring ambulation versus some other areas as well. So the question we had in advance was that was from someone who spoke about they had late onset limb-girdle muscular dystrophy and lost strength in their legs, and has a power chair with a riser and a recliner chair, which enables them to make up in some way for that impact on their legs. However, their arms now have very little power as well, and they can't lift a glass without the elbow being on the table. And the question really around was whether there's anything similar to a power chair that helps with upper body, what kind of adaptations might be available, what kind of support equipment might be available to someone with upper body issues. I saw some nods. Rachel, have you got anything to add on this?
If it's with regards to, perhaps a lot of people, some here perhaps maybe add something to it, but if they've having difficulties with eating and drinking, and have they ever tried a knee-to-eater arm support for the chair that could facilitate and help with their arm movement? And obviously there's a lot of equipment out there, extended straws, etc., for helping and assisting with eating and drinking, and different levels and heights of tables, etc. And if they link in with AROT, that should be able to help as well.
Great, thank you. Any sort of from the, yeah, Meredith, thank you.
I think the fact about the riser function for people with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy and power wheelchair provision, riser functions aren't standard, but they really should be. It is critical that that inch of being able to rise is the difference between the independence in a transfer and not. And I think part of our DISFEL and standard of care work is a little bit about wheelchair provision internationally, and about the fact that that simple piece of relatively inexpensive kit on a wheelchair prescription is critical for somebody with limb-girdle. And we do spend a lot of time writing letters to wheelchair services to allow a wheelchair seating colleagues to be aware that in limb-girdle, that is that's far more, I think it's more critical perhaps than tilting space necessarily in a wheelchair for somebody with limb-girdle. Just reducing that distance between the table and your mouth is really important when you are losing the ability to bend your elbow, and arm supports, Knee-to-Eater and other brands of arm supports are possible to be trialled, and definitely a chat with your neuromuscular team, your wheelchair service and your OT.
And I'm going to do a quick plug, thanks for that, Meredith, a quick plug for the Joseph Patrick Trust, or the JPT program that MDUK runs. We've recently actually adjusted the scope of that program exactly for that issue, actually. So if you are provided with a chair by the NHS and they don't fund the riser, come to us, because our grants can top up that payment to ensure you can have a riser, because we completely agree actually that function of the riser is so important to people that we felt it was necessary we did that. The second question we had around upper body was actually more about the progression of the condition, using upper body as an example. So I think, I can't remember which panelist it was, but someone talked about proactively managing the condition. So if someone who's already feels they're no longer able to use their legs and has arm strength but is losing that, and their question really is around how will the condition continue to progress, and I guess what can be done to kind of manage the maintaining function for as long as possible. We've got too big a panel, that's the problem, and there's so many experts on the panel, it's hard to know who to go to first. Thank you, Meredith.
So we need to be, whoever the clinician is seeing patients needs to be checking upper limb function, not just the strength, but actually the function of the arm. How well is somebody being able to lift their arms up at each clinic? Involvement of an occupational therapist is critical around upper limb function. Generally, limb-girdle progresses from the shoulder girdle down towards the hand. Some limb-girdle subtypes have no involvement of the hands whatsoever. So for certain subtypes, you will be able to learn from your team that actually you don't need to worry about your hand function, but you might have more trouble bending your elbow and taking your hand to your mouth, even though you can still use your fingers. And so it is specific to each limb-girdle. And again, this is where this natural history data comes in by using the right assessments in clinic and in the studies, then we'll understand more about how the arm is affected in the different limb girdle subtypes, so we can understand what is going to happen in the future to be able to inform people. But the first thing is in clinic, making sure your arm is being assessed in clinic and the onward referrals are being made to the appropriate healthcare professionals.
Thanks, Meredith. Anything to add from the panel before we move on to the next question? Yes, Jenny, thank you.
Yes, I was just going to completely agree about different forms of mobile arm support. And also regarding the riser, I completely agree with Meredith. Unfortunately, a lot of wheelchair services seem to offer either tilt in space or recline or riser. So actually, that's really good to know that Joseph Patrick can help with that. That's really useful to hear. The other thing about upper limb is not forgetting upper limbs when you are exercising, and to do something, whether that is self-propelling the wheelchair, but trying to maintain muscle strength. And I think quite often with children particularly, there's a lot of focus on the ambulation, on the walking, and we have to remember looking ahead that we need to keep upper limb strength as much as possible.
And Rachel, coming to you.
Yes, I'd just like to add, obviously, I've got quite a few families that I've cared for, from paediatrics through transition to adulthood, where there may be 4 children affected within the one family. And I think anticipatory grief is a lot that we've got to consider as well, to ensure that we're supporting the families, that just because one member of the family the trajectory of the disease might work in a certain way, it's totally individual, and it's variable. And trying to manage everybody as an individual, because I found that can lead to a lot of emotional triggers and challenges as well, when they're anticipating that they will lose the function the same as their sibling, etc.
Thanks, Rachel. Geordie, I think you came off mute. That was either an error or you'd like to come in on this one.
Was an error. Sorry.
I've got a question for you coming up. Don't worry. I've got Martin. Thank you.
Yeah. So just saying two things actually, going back quite a bit. What Rachel was saying is sensitive because my brother is 2 years older than me, so I see his progression, and then I take on that expectation myself, and sometimes that can be really sad, you know. So that's something that gets me quite emotional as well. And also, Jenny, what you were saying about that teenager that was extremely angry before going to any sort of physio or exercise, I would say to anyone that the hardest part of exercise or physio or the gym is starting. You know, if you can initially get 30 seconds into it, then you'll be on your way. The hardest part of any exercise or your attendance to the gym is getting there. As soon as you overcome that barrier, honestly, I feel it myself. It's some days so I go to the dojo Wednesday and a Friday lunchtime, and sometimes at 11 o'clock on an hour before I'm due to go, I'm trying to find a reason not to, or an excuse. I've got a meeting at work, I'm too tired, whatever it may be. But as soon as you get in there and get the first 30 seconds underway, then you know that you're doing the right thing. And you know, I know there's a lot of people on the call, and they'll be saying how difficult I know it is the most difficult thing in the world, but as soon as you start, you'll reap the benefits afterwards. Like I said, 30 seconds into it, you're on your way.
Thank you, Martin. We've sort of sticking to a bit of the theme on exercise. Sadly, I think the answer to this question is it depends on where you live, but someone's asked how would they be referred to hydrotherapy? And I know that provision is patchy and has become even patchier post-pandemic. But yeah, if someone wants to try and access hydrotherapy, how would they find out if there is anything local? Thank you, Meredith.
I think as someone with limb girdle, the best way to do it is actually go and see pools, because what could be considered accessible might not actually be accessible for you if it involves ramps, and your limb-girdle muscular dystrophy makes walking up a ramp very difficult. I would actually, engage with your local community as well, just to see what other people who have muscle conditions around you might be using, and there might be some hidden gems that might not be obvious necessarily to your NHS clinician. Of course, your own neuromuscular service where you get seen might be known, but that said, I think it's good to have a look at what's around in your local environment first, see whether there's actually a warm pool, a community pool, and most importantly, what's the access in and out of it before you get referred to a certain centre. There are NHS pools, there are private pools, but as we know, the provision is incredibly difficult in the UK and incredibly patchy.
Thanks, Meredith. Yeah, sadly, that is definitely okay. I think hydrotherapy is becoming harder to access, which is not great. We talked a bit about fatigue earlier in the session, and someone asked specifically a question around that. And actually, another plug for MDUK, working alongside several care advisors and physios, we produced a fatigue guideline document earlier this year, which covers is relevant to all muscular dystrophies, I think. And the question is, my son has limb-girdle LGMD1 and is always very fatigued. He's 15. He's particularly exhausted after PE at school. Is that to be expected? I'm seeing nods from everybody. I think Jenny.
Yes, I would just say it's about pacing, really. So yes, do PE, but don't push yourself if it's feeling too much. It's fine to have a 5-minute break and to join in again, so long as the PE teacher understands the condition, and it is about pacing. Yeah, added to which 15-year-olds tend to be tired anyway, all 15-year-olds, but obviously much worse with limb-girdle. But I think that the answer is pacing.
And Rachel, in terms of your role as a care advisor, is having that kind of conversation with the school about adapting around someone? Is that something you could support families with?
So in the paediatric and adult sector, I find very instrumental is acting as an advocate for the families. So often they may be early on in the diagnosis and still finding it very hard to talk about it and the impact it has on them, even though this may have been their norm. So just making contact with the school, with the Senko in the school, just little things like allowing the child to come out, 5 minutes before class, or just, perhaps integrating certain activities into warm-up exercises within the school so it becomes their norm as well. And sometimes I've talked to other class members as well and done some education in the school so that the pupils feel more supportive than the family, just so they're given that extra support and understanding of their condition, that they will fatigue it a lot easier than other peers.
Thanks, Rachel. We've got a very specific question. I think this may be for Geordie, but that you may not be able to answer. And it's about that horrible term comorbidities, i.e., two or more sort of things coming together. So it's someone who is receiving a hormone therapy called exemestane, and just wonder if there's any experience of a patient with LGMD taking that. And I wonder if there's a broader question around things like hormone therapy for people living with the impact of things like hormone therapy if you also have limb-girdle muscular dystrophy.
I don't know about that specific hormone, unfortunately, so I cannot answer that specific question. But yes, in the past there have been some trials especially in preclinical models, to test testosterone and androgens, for example, in these mice, with the idea to increase the muscle size. And although that's possible, it's possible to increase the bulk of your muscles. In patients with muscle disease, that doesn't mean that you are going to improve your muscle strength or your muscle function. So most of the treatments trying to improve or increase the muscle size have failed, because although they successfully arrive to increase the size, this doesn't come along with an increase in muscle function.
Great, thank you. And we've got what might be our final question, which I think also comes back to you, Geordie, if that's right. So someone who's participated in the 100,000 Genomes project and is still without a diagnosis, is RNA sequencing different and might perhaps provide that?
Yes, so the idea is that, of course, the technology progresses. 100,000 genome was a project that it's not very new, I would say. It's something that it's close now, and what is really interesting is that we have now the possibility to recover the data that was generated with that project and reanalyze with the new software that we have. So I would encourage this person to contact his or her clinician and ask if that is possible, because there are new softwares that can help to identify the mutation in this raw data, what we call the raw data. Okay. RNA-seq can be a solution for these patients, of course, yes. So it's something that can help us to identify a decrease of mutations in the RNA that is not present in the DNA, or identify a reduced number of RNA copies, which means that if a gene is mutated, the number of RNA copies is lower. So that's something that, of course, can be applied. So yes, the answer is yes.
Thank you. That sort of brings us to a close of the session. So I'd like to sort of thank everyone. Before I formally close the session, I'd like to give Martin the opportunity to say anything he thinks hasn't been covered, or anything he'd like to sort of add. Or you may have nothing to add, Martin. That's fine. But I just want to give you that opportunity at the end of our session.
No, I haven't really got anything to add. I just think it's a fantastic thing that we see these seminars and we bring these professional people together to tell people like myself in the community that we are working for treatments and cures for limb-girdle. We're not being left behind, and the fact that I'm now on the inside, I can try and push things faster as well. But I do appreciate the fact that clinical trials can be up to 10 years before they come sort of over counterculture. So no, it's great, and I really appreciate everybody that's spoken today. It's fantastic to hear these people that are working hard on our behalf.
Thanks, Martin. I guess my key takeaway is that I won't schedule meetings that allow you to get out of going to dojo. So I'm not going to enable you not to do that, I'm afraid. So I'd like to say a huge thanks to our panel, to everybody who's taken part. Thank you to everyone who fed in questions either in advance or in the session. It's the questions that really help make the session super valuable and keeps us on our toes as the panel and chair. So thank you very much. A reminder that the recording of this session will be made available over the next few days on our website. Thanks again to our sponsors, PTC, Therapeutics and Sarepta. And yeah, do jump on our website as well for future sessions that are coming up. And thank you very much for your time. Have a good rest of the day, everybody. And I'm sure I'll see you all soon. Thank you very much. Take care.